Hello, everyone. I'm Sam Schaefer with the Poultry Science Association, and thank you for tuning in to this month's episode of Let's Squawk About It. Our guest is Billy Hargis from the University of Arkansas's JKS Poultry Health Laboratory. We will be discussing animal susceptibility to viruses with a focus on COVID-19. Billy, thank you for joining me on this call. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your area of expertise?
Hi, it's my pleasure, Sam. I'm a veterinarian, poultry veterinarian, and also a PhD. Our area of work is in poultry health, and we've got a large laboratory here at the University of Arkansas Division of Agriculture. We work with infectious diseases of poultry, and that's kind of what we do.
Awesome. Why don't we jump into some questions here? I know that a few weeks ago we saw across the media there was a confirmed case of a dog falling ill to COVID-19. And before that, there were felines falling ill, household cats and tigers at the Bronx Zoo getting the virus. So do you think this is a virus that can spread to avian species and specifically chickens?
Well, the simple answer is, and I think the important answer, Sam, is no. Humans are not going to contract this from chickens. It's very unlikely that chickens will be infected from humans. And it's not likely to cause any significant disease. Having said that, it's pretty normal for viruses to jump from one species to another. It happens with low frequency, very low frequency. Of course, when you have, millions of potential exposures, then it's something that's low frequency can happen occasionally. Most of the time, when a virus jumps between species of animals, and in this context, humans are within kingdom Animalia, we're animals too. When that happens, most of the time, the virus may be able to infect that one new species that's infected, but usually isn't able to transmit from to other members of the species. So when we have something like happened in December of last year with the COVID-19 jumping from some animal species, those events don't happen all that rarely in the world. What's rare is that when it jumped into humans, that virus was relatively immediately able to jump from human to human with what we call a case reproductive rate. How many new cases do you get from an existing case? The cases where an occasional canine or feline might be infected from a human, it's not likely that that's going to spread horizontally within feline or canine populations. And I don't believe there's any evidence whatsoever that those animals have been able to shed sufficient virus to infect other humans. You would obviously be careful with an animal if you knew it was infected with a virus that came from humans. But I don't think there's any evidence that it's spreading among feline populations from cat to cat in any significant way, nor from dog to dog. And I don't expect that to happen. It's a bigger jump when you go from one class of animals, class Mammalia, such as dogs, cats, and humans, to an avian species. They're evolutionarily disparate. That also does happen, but it happens with less frequency than it does, between birds, for example, or between mammals. But it does happen occasionally. It's exceedingly unlikely that it's going to jump from humans to poultry. And even if it did, it's unlikely that it would jump from poultry, from a chicken or a turkey to another chicken or a turkey. So I think the risk there is precisely zero, or so close to zero that it can't be stated any other way.
Right. And it does sound like this is a virus that is affecting class Mammalia, like you mentioned, and with birds and poultry being in another class entirely, I can see how it would be something that isn't very likely to jump between the classes. That makes complete sense. Is there a risk or a concern with meat being contaminated? I mean, the other week we talked to Ken Macklin at Auburn University, and we talked about poultry products flying off the shelves and other meat products now being in shortage. And is there any concern there that you foresee with this virus, like contaminating meat or being a concern to consumers?
That's a good question. No, the simple answer again is just absolutely not. This is a respiratory virus, Sam, and the route of transmission overwhelmingly is from respiratory tract to respiratory tract, human to human. We know that there's some small things that we can do that are important, and I'm not negating those, but like washing hands frequently and cleaning surfaces and so forth. But I would wager that even those things that we know could potentially transmit COVID-19 are just a tiny fraction of the number of transmission events that occur in people, where the overwhelming majority of cases are going to be respiratory to respiratory transmission. You know, and it's people who sneeze or cough, or in an environment where people are speaking loudly. You know, when we talk, we have particles of sputum discharge that comes out of our mouths, and we talk loudly, we're spreading more. Right now, you're safe because you're behind the only way you could get infected from me would be somehow electrons would carry it to the internet. So that's not going to happen. That one I can just say definitively will not happen. But really, it's a respiratory type of disease. COVID-19, like other coronaviruses, is very susceptible to heat. Somewhere around 60 degrees Celsius, which is about 140 degrees Fahrenheit, well below boiling, and activates coronaviruses completely. And that's not a guess, that's a fact. And so once a food of any kind is cooked, it is no longer effective. And that goes for an awful lot of diseases that could potentially be transmitted by food. Surfaces of fresh meat and poultry would not be good media for survival of the COVID-19 virus. And the possibility that the numbers that would survive for any length of time could somehow possibly infect a human, I mean, the answer really is quite clearly no. That's not going to happen. The possibility that could occur even with fresh produce is really tiny.
It does make sense to me from what I've heard from medical experts and poultry scientists such as yourself from working at PSA, that heat really does play a factor. The possibility of it even surviving on those kind of fresh meat surfaces is extremely low. So if anyone did even have a remote concern about it, cooking the meat would take care of it beside the fact.
I could just say one more word on that. You know, when you said heat, I think we need to be very clear that we're talking about cooking, and we're talking very low temperature cooking. I don't think anyone would cook poultry or beef or pork as low as 140 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a very low temperature. That would be very low. That's lower than slow cooking in terms of temperature, and that will kill the virus. It just flat out kill the virus. No ifs, ands, or buts. No virus survives that. It's important to differentiate that from the potential seasonality that occurs with some viruses in terms of environmental temperatures. For many viruses, there's evidence that warm temperatures reduce the viability of the virus in the air. It may have something to do with humidity as well. And so some seasonal colds and influenza tend to decline in the summer and come back in the fall and winter. At this point, there's not really any evidence that that's true for COVID-19, as far as I'm aware. And if you look at the states within the U.S. that where the spread is occurring fairly rapidly. If you look at countries in the world that at this time are still very high temperature, it seems to be spreading just fine.
Mm-hmm.
And high environmental temperatures. So I just wanted to distinguish when you said heat that we're talking about cooking. High environmental temperatures where humans can live. I don't think there's much evidence that that's going to save us this summer.
And that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up because that was going to be my follow-up question when we were discussing heat. What was your thought on the seasonal changes? Because I mean, right now in Illinois, we're still experiencing chills. I mean, it's 50 degrees, which is cool for this time of year. Up here,
Sao Paulo, for example, in Brazil, is still really quite warm. It has been. And even though Brazil's not testing, they're testing even less than the United States. So we don't have a lot of data. It does appear to be spreading really quite well in Sao Paulo right now, as well as parts of India and so forth. So Florida, the virus seems to be doing okay right now, and it's quite warm there. So I don't believe summer is going to save us. It would be my opinion.
Let's switch gears a little bit and discuss something that I've heard a lot of people worry about is antibiotic use in food. When an animal receives an antibiotic, I've always been under the assumption that the antibiotic doesn't get stored in the meat we consume or causes issues to the animal. Is that correct?
There are lots of different ways to look at that question. I think I want to be clear up front that yes, when approved antibiotics are used to treat or prevent poultry diseases, and when withdrawal times are properly followed, there are no antibiotic residues in the meat, period, end of story. The half-life is such that you can calculate that not a molecule exists by the time the birds actually go to processing and become food. With approved antibiotics for use in poultry and following the approved withdrawal times, treated at the approved levels. To my knowledge, and I think I have quite a bit of knowledge on this, there is no cheating on antibiotic use. You don't use a non-approved antibiotic, you don't use it at any higher dose than what's recommended, and you don't short the withdrawal time at all. As a matter of fact, in most cases, the withdrawal time is going to exceed what's really required by law. And those withdrawal times for Food and Drug Administration approved drugs, those withdrawal times are calculated to be, zero residue of antibiotics. But that's not the real reason that there's controversy. The real validity of antibiotic concerns comes with drug resistance of bacteria. Within North America, we're talking totally about bacteria. We don't use antifungal drugs. We don't use antiviral drugs for agricultural animals, period. So we're talking about bacterial antibiotic resistance. And the concern is that somehow we create some commensal, some resistance to an antibiotic among commensal bacteria. And bacteria can occasionally exchange extrachromosomal DNA. It's not within their genome. It's extrachromosomal. They're called plasmids, and they can exchange this DNA that can encode for many things that are useful to bacteria under some circumstances, including antibiotic resistance. So the hypothesis goes, if poultry or cattle or whatever are treated with an antibiotic, then you might get some resistance among beneficial commensal bacteria. Some of those commensal bacteria could perhaps survive the processing plant, where there are a few of those are still left, and they're not pathogenic at all. And those could then colonize the human gastrointestinal tract and then hand off that resistant DNA to a pathogen of humans. It's not real clear that happens at all. And overwhelmingly, the problem with antibiotic resistance among pathogens of humans is the overuse of antibiotics in humans. So one of the things that has occurred over the last 10, 15 years, I guess, in poultry is that first line drugs for choices by physicians, such as fluoroquinolone antibiotics like ciprofloxacin, that many people are familiar with, the third generation cephalosporins and fourth generation cephalosporins. Those drugs are not used in poultry, and most of the drugs that are used are not first-line drug choices at all for humans. And as I said before, even then, the likelihood of transmitting resistance through this circuitous route is very, very low. One example are the ionophore coccidiostats, and they're used for controlling coccidiosis in poultry. Those technically are antibiotics, but they're not used for any human disease. They're not used at all. There's no indication for an ionophore for treatment of human diseases. But nevertheless, since they are technically antibiotic, antibacterial compounds, or they do have some antibacterial effect, to be able to label poultry raised without antibiotics, those drugs cannot be used. That one's kind of a shame because it's really hard to get your arms around how this could possibly, just even in the wildest theory, could result in any hazard to antimicrobial resistance for human pathogens. It's just, there's no possibility. It's kind of a shame because these protozoal pathogens, Eimeria species that cause coccidiosis in poultry, controlling those and other pathogens as well. It's a animal well-being issue to be able to effectively control disease outbreaks or to prevent disease outbreaks. I will say, Sam, that the data supports right now that the vast majority, I mean, more than half of poultry that are entering the food chain in the United States have never seen an antibiotic ever. So that is how well the industry does in terms of management, hygiene, and so forth.
It sounds like, ultimately there is just a lot of negative perception about it, and it's not as big of a concern as a lot of consumers try to make it out to be.
I think it's misunderstanding, really, and it's lack of education. It sounds bad, that I'm going to eat meat from an animal that was treated with a drug. Therefore, I'm going to be consuming a drug. Well, that's just not the case. People can eat poultry labeled as raised without antibiotics or conventionally raised, and they're not eating antibiotics.
Billy, thank you so much for offering your insight into viruses and the current situations going on in today's society. We appreciate it. And thank you everyone for tuning in. For PSA, I'm Sam Schaefer. Billy, thanks again.
You're welcome, Sam. Thank you.